Today's topic is going to be a conversation with Justin Riehl, the head of TPRM services at CastleHill. And we're going to be talking about how to improve assessment responses with the CastleHill Assessment Portal. Hey, Justin, thank you for joining me. So can you explain a little bit about your role at CastleHill?
I'm a CastleHill principal with ownership of the CastleHill TPRM practice and the supporting platforms.
Thank you. So we're here today to talk a little bit about two things, really. And they tie together. Of course, one is around how to be efficient with, getting to vendors, talking to respondents, getting that information together, but also the CastleHill Assessment Portal. So can you provide me with a quick overview of the portal, the CAP, as we like to call it?
Sure. The CastleHill Assessment Portal is designed essentially to allow internal and external assessment where the product of the assessment, the outcome is consumed by some type of an authoritative system rather than originated on the authoritative system, which avoids obvious issues related to security, infrastructure and access restrictions, training, as well as license count considerations.
So yeah, why do we build it? Why do we do these?
Well, we built it to make it easier for our customers to leverage their investment in existing capabilities without having to replace something where another object on their infrastructure probably already does 80% of what they need it to do. So this is intended to extend the abilities of their core platforms to leverage the investments that they've already made in their platforms without having to buy something new.
And how does it help respondents? Right? Where does that part of it come in? The folks who actually have to suffer through the questionnaire and the responses.
Well, it helps a respondent in a lot of ways. One, is very easy to use. It's very easy to navigate. So training considerations aren't really a large concern. It's if you can navigate as you would through a normal web application, this is just as easy. You can engage large populations of internal and external respondents. So it's not limited to just one or the other. And some of the big key concepts behind the platform is the ability to reuse previous assessment responses. So instead of starting from net zero, you can take a response that you received previously, provide that back to the respondent and just allow them to add or subtract new information as applicable.
So that's a very interesting feature. Do you see that becoming more important to our clients and to the third-party risk community overall?
I think it is. It lowers the amount of overhead on both the analysts and the responders, provides them an opportunity to reuse previous information without having to start from scratch. We find that the assessments that come in from a reuse perspective are typically much faster, anywhere where a existing or a new assessment can take upwards of 53 days. We see reuse assessments coming in about 13 days. So there's a huge improvement in productivity.
Yep, awesome. And is the information still accurate? I know in some cases people were always worried that if you give people the answers, they're just going to, accept everything that's there. How do we guard against that in the portal?
Well, we have analysts sitting between the responder and the assessing organization, and we can generally understand when a piece of documentation that was provided earlier potentially needs to be updated. Different types of certification documents or bridge letters when they become necessary. We can also see when a question was answered or skipped over, for example. So the analyst being able to go into the system and ask for clarifying information and updated information prevents us to a large degree from any of the negative outcomes of just sending it back the way it was.
Yeah. And that's one of the key benefits of the portal, if that aspect of being able to have that communication and the back and forth between the analysts. Is that fair?
That's fair. And so we built a capability in the platform to be able to handle that. One of the things that the CAP does that is very uncommon, except in the much, much larger platforms, is the ability for the responder and for the vendor analyst to be able to communicate back and forth inside the platform as opposed to sending out multiple email trails. What that does is it presents an opportunity for a much more instantaneous type of communication. It provides a log to auditors so that they can see all the communications that happen between the analyst and the responder. And frankly, it just makes it easier for everybody at the end. Also, our analysts are able to go into the system after the response has been submitted and look at those questions that receive a large number of questions. And that tells us that maybe we need to reformulate the question a little bit or provide more clarity in the responses that we're asking for.
So improve the question so that we get better responses, right? That's
correct.
That's
better
a key part of it.
data points, more usable information. Absolutely.
Yep. Cool. And you mentioned that everything is logged from an audit perspective. Is it everything, or is it some things? What do we get?
It's most things. You see when the analyst is logging in and when the responder logs in. You see the dates and times of various communications. You can see when the system switched the status of an assessment, for example, from pending risk analysis to complete, or when it's been sent out, or in some cases, even where we took that assessment and we performed a conversion inside the platform. It's very easy, one click, where it creates a Microsoft Excel workbook for the responder to use, as opposed to going through the UI. So they really have two modes of providing a response. And so that that capability is captured for auditors as well.
Yep, awesome. I know one other area that is sometimes a challenge is understanding the progress of an assessment. You know, it goes out to a responder, and the responder, you know, sits on it for a couple of weeks, and then they're nervous about responding, and you know, you get into that loop of back, you know, like you said, you know, 53 days or so before you're actually getting the responses. You know, is there any management tools within the portal, any ways to get that kind of visibility into the progress of things?
Well, we have reports, and typically we'll see when there's large gaps. For example, we can see where something was sent and received by the respondent, but they're at 0% or 5% complete, and there's only 4 days left until the ending due date. That tells the analyst that maybe they need to reach out and facilitate some type of success at that point. Often, maybe they don't understand the questions, or you know, they have other priorities in their organization. We know that happens. That's a very legitimate excuse. So giving the analysts the opportunity to see that information and understand where there may be problems with achieving a successful response within a given time frame, it gives them the power to reach out and try to head off any issues before that happens.
And how do you think the community, right? So the actual respondent community, how do they react to that kind of interaction? Is it helping them? Is it just making them, you know, just like this whole process worse? What's the value from a, you know, a people perspective?
Well, it doesn't make the process any worse. It's made to be a facilitating activity, which is nice. Many times we note that responders are grateful for the reminder, even if they're not looking forward to the work itself. That's again, that's acceptable. But you know, in the end, I think that having the ability to provide that type of communication and being more of a warm facilitator of the process rather than constant emails back and forth and reminders, nagifications, we call them. We think that the ability for the analysts to be able to see what's going on early and engage early is really a key to success.
Awesome. What do you think the biggest, just sort of getting away from the CAP for a minute, what do you see as the biggest challenge for responders? Is it the volume of questions? That's sort of an old problem, maybe. Is it, you know, what are sort of the top 3 most painful parts of the process for respondents, do you think?
Top 3 pain points for responders are the length of the questionnaires, the complexity of the questions that are in them, and the inability to use previously provided responses. Those seem to be the top 3. There's also one other, and if you think about it from the perspective of the responder, where, you know, we typically have a lot of sympathy. If you have an organization that has 5,000 customers and 2,500 of those customers are asking you to complete a 1,000 question assessment every year, that's an awful lot of overhead. So the ability to reuse the responses that they provided in the past is actually a huge leg up on getting visibility from all of the other people who are asking for the same question. It's a much lower overhead, and it satisfies some of the concerns around just the bulk of assessments that a responder may be asked to respond to over a given year.
Which is, I don't want to get too far away from our main topic, but that's something which we offer as well as it's an interesting service offering in your arsenal that you have as well. So.
It is a service offering, and we're continuing to improve that. That would be the response as a service I think you're referring to.
Yep.
Where we actually perform those responses on behalf of our customers, vendors. There we go, and our customers.
Excellent. So you mentioned before about the length of the questionnaire and some of those things, just again, from the industry perspective, what have you been seeing that's helping to improve or decrease the number of questions or make them more targeted, any of those sort of things? What are you seeing in the industry?
I think in the industry, you're seeing a large move toward more themed questionnaires as opposed to 2,000 questions. You may have to deal with 5 or 6 questions within 50 different themes around security. And I think that the industry is moving closer and closer to being able to solidify the content that they send for each vendor type. In the past, it was always a matter of everybody fighting about what should be the appropriate standard, I guess. And instead, what you get is just a lot of competition between competing interests. So it's more the approach rather than the questionnaire content that's been the movement over the last 18 to 24 months.
Where do you see it going from here?
I see it going to more, I see 2 things happening. On the assessor's side, I see moving toward more simplified assessments and questionnaires. On the responder side, we're seeing a huge movement toward them creating response packages and negotiating first that the requester take their security package as opposed to ask them to fill out the 1,000 questions. So we see movements in both of those areas very strong.
Awesome. Okay. Just back to the assessment portal. So now we've had a respondent. They've been helped by our analyst teams. They've now entered in all their information. What's that? They've gone back and forth potentially with different questions. What happens next? What are the next activities that happen? Does it just all flush into a system? Where do we go from here?
You're talking at the point where the responder has provided the analyst with a product, correct?
Yep.
Yep. So there are a few things within the CAP. If we're talking about the CAP specifically, there are a number of things that you can do with the information that's in there. There is a capability to add notes. Notes are blind to the responder. They're mostly internal considerations, information for audit, that type of thing. You can provide findings. Findings are the precursor to establishing issues. If you have a finding with a particular question or a particular section of a given questionnaire, you can provide those findings, and all of this flows back into the system. I guess we'll talk about that in a minute. But once you have your findings, you can also move on. You can review all the supporting documentation that was provided by the responder. And you can also provide feedback to the responder, which we talked about a little bit previously, but that allows the analyst to request additional information, updated supporting documentation or new supporting documentation for a given question or section of questions, and then send that back to the responder. The responder, once that happens, the assessment goes back into a responder mode. They provide that information. It comes back to the analyst very quickly. And at that point, if that satisfies the need, then they can go ahead and close out the rest of the assessment. At that point, the assessment is accepted. We've identified our notes, our findings. We've reviewed the supporting documentation and provided any type of commentary that was requested, and we can close out the assessment. And now it's ready to go back to whatever the parent system was, whatever that authoritative system was that controls who's being assessed and to what extent.
And I know you've mentioned before that sometimes when we're working with customers on the phone, that will actually facilitate the entry of the data entry part as well. It's another unique feature for the CAP, isn't it?
Yeah, anytime that we can speak one-on-one with the
Mhm.
responder and record those results directly, it's always a big benefit.
Is that just because of the quality is going to be there, or just closing it out, pragmatically?
Well, there's a lot of pragmatism associated with it, but being able to speak back and forth allows us to dig down into some of the deeper questions without multiple emails. So it's generally much faster, and the quality of the data is much better. Yeah.
Yep. And all of these different interactions, or the actual analyst work, all that information is also captured in that audit log you mentioned before. Is that true?
It is. There is, with respect to conversations or those types of interactions that happen off platform, it's really on the vendor analyst to log that in the CAP to say that the conversation happened and this is what we got out of it. But that's fairly rare that the platform does capture the majority of interactions that happen. So you can do it either way. And
Yep.
you generally find that in the notes section again for a given question, that some type of a discussion happened and this is the result.
Yep. Great. All right. So we've got now everything. The analyst has finished their job, and we want to get this back into Archer. We want to get it back into RSA Archer, who's the parent system.
Right.
What happens now?
So when you send the information back to the parent system, I guess we'll use Archer as the example,
Yep.
that data flows right in, and you've already configured your authoritative system to consume that information, add it to metrics, making sure that the reports have been updated, and then use the system to perform any types of system notifications, for example, or notifications to people internally to let them know that that assessment has been completed, the information has been added to all of the reports, the iViews, and at that point they can decision how they want to move forward with that vendor. The whole idea is that you want to provide decision makers with all the information they need to make good decisions. And by flowing back into the parent system and allowing all of those linkages to occur and all of those reports to be generated, that generally provides them what they need.
Awesome. And maybe just quickly, without getting too technical, can we just talk a little bit about what the platform is behind all of this? What the how these things interact? Are we creating additional holes in the firewall? What's all the architecture behind it?
Are you talking about the connection between the CAP and the parent system, for
And the cap
example?
itself, just where does it live in the world?
The CAP lives in AWS in a secure environment, logically separated. Everybody has their own application server and their own data sets. There's no commingling of data. It's served in a basic Microsoft stack, so it's very secure. And the communications themselves are very simple. It uses a combination of reports and secure FTP to get the information back and forth. And so we don't have to worry about any of the parameters around external users having access or authenticating behind a firewall. So
So totally separate, but dependent upon the parent system.
completely separate. It brings in the information. It'll bring in all of the questions and the structure replicated in the CAP very easily. So you can use existing questionnaires that are already in your parent system. That's fine. The CAP likes that. And then it brings in that information, allows the responder to populate that information, and then brings it back in, all without the need for any type of complicated authentication or
Yep.
SSL.
Okay. Excellent. We've been talking a lot about the vendor respondents. What about internal respondents? If I want to send out my inherent risk questionnaire, in your world, and for vendors or the vendor managers, is the cap something we can use there too, or what's the mechanism on that side of it?
You would use the CAP exactly the same way as you do for an external responder. The benefit internally, of course, is that you don't have to train somebody to answer the questions or connect them to your authoritative system. I guess Archer being a good example.
Yep.
So you don't need to consume license keys. You don't need to provide any type of special training. You provide the questionnaire in your parent system, send it out to the CAP. And then in this case, the respondent is just somebody internal to your organization, as opposed to an external respondent from one of your service providers.
And how do you feel the importance of the inherent risk or establishing what the inherent risk of a vendor has evolved over the last couple of years?
I think the inherent risk was something that everybody talked about 5 years ago, but nobody really did anything. Today, what you're seeing is an organization using some type of an inherent risk qualification or questionnaire as being the first entry point for any type of service provider engagement. And now, inherent risk questionnaires, which have become extremely popular and very useful, are being used for vendor segmentation, applying appropriate scope to assessments as they're being sent out. Gives you good categorization and provides you with an opportunity to compare your service providers on a peer level. So inherent risk has become very important over the last 5 years, much more than it was. Or I should say it was important 5 years ago, but people are doing a lot more with it now. It's become
Yeah.
more of a precursor to how we engage risks, either internally or externally being service providers, of course.
Yep. Awesome. And you mentioned also the tiering aspects of it. So, um, what would you say? I think 3 or 4 years ago, similar time frame, people had a tendency to tier very heavily in one way or another. Everyone was critical, or no one was critical.
Right,
What
right.
are you seeing from the data quality and improvements there?
A few things have happened in the industry that have made things easier. One, tiering used to be high, medium, or low, basically, and it was done numerically through through a score being generated at the end of the questionnaire. The industry has moved toward a more granular rating of tiers. We'll say 1 through 5, just for simplicity's sake. And instead of the tiers being generated through some type of a numerical calculation, association with tiers has become a subjective exercise, in that you say for all vendors who have access to A through C, they're tier 1. Everybody who has access to other areas would be tier 2, tier 3, et cetera. So we see a lot more, we see a much more sensible approach to tiering as a result.
Yep. Awesome. And I'm assuming that when I tier somebody, I am also then scoping the types of questions I'm going to ask. Right back to your thematic questions you mentioned before. How does that play out in the parent system, and then how does the portal react to that tiering overall?
The tiering, the way it's set up, just provides a immediate distinguishing score around, or I should say categorization,
Mhm.
showing the difference between a service provider who has effectively keys to the kingdom, lots of access, administrative infrastructure, permissions, and those persons who come in the evening and feed the fish and water the plants. So
Mhm.
it does play a lot into the scoping. It provides a lot of opportunities for automated scoping, which is a movement that we've seen in the last 3 years. Previously, you would have a specific tier, or you would have indicators in specific risk domains, and it would be the analyst who goes in and scopes or doesn't scope it at all and just sends the whole thing to a vendor.
Yep.
Now we're seeing a lot more interaction based on better tiering, better risk domain qualification, better understanding of the service provider types and what they have access to. And so I think the responders are really the big beneficiaries of that level of efficiency.
Yeah. No more not applicable answers, right? Or fewer not applicable answers
We hope
because
fewer,
yeah.
right?
Yep. Awesome. Yeah. And so how does the CAP deal with that as well, right? Because is that completely different configuration? How does the CAP manage those different types of question sets that may come for different tiers?
So the question set for the tiers would come from the parent system, of course. They would understand at the level of the engagement in Archer, for example, how they should apply scope. But the CAP also provides a mechanism where the analyst, once it's brought into the platform, can actually change the scope if they receive additional information. It gives them the ability to decrease the scope or increase the scope or specific sections, for example. So having that inherent risk information available to the analyst in the CAP, the precursor to the actual assessment, as well as giving them the opportunity to perform some decision making around what should be sent to the vendor, the CAP will facilitate that. It's not necessary to go back to the parent system and start the whole process over. You can do that right in the platform, which is nice.
Awesome. And the those different questions when I answer, my favorite feature of responding to them as I have to sometimes for Castle Hill is, of course, I answer the first question and suddenly 13 other questions pop up, and I can't, I have to go and gather some additional information. And so I end up losing all of my responses because I time out or other problems like that. So how does the CAP help facilitate those sort of parent-child relationships and the sort of terrible problem of you got to finish this all within 5 minutes, or the whole system's blown up, or you can't take the 5-minute coffee break as we are now.
Right, and then you lose everything.
Yeah.
No, the CAP solves both of those issues. You'll still have the parent-child relationships, or more of what we refer to as the reflexive responses. Unfortunately, your responders are still subject to that.
Mhm.
However, the system auto saves as the responder is going through the platform, and they can walk away and take that coffee break or start fighting a fire, and it times out on them after I think it's 15 minutes. When they come back, all the information that they'd put in previously is still there. No need to start over,
That's
which is
a
nice.
big advantage.
It
Yeah.
is. Yep.
Yep. And that information that's being saved, because it's being saved out in the portal, it's not like you're polluting half-finished answers into your parent system or things of that sort.
It does a lot to maintain data quality, and that's one of the reasons also why you may not necessarily want a survey or an assessment to be completed in the parent system, in the authoritative system, because partial answers or unresolved responses may still show up in your reporting. So having this information on the CAP, waiting until the response is complete and has been approved and evaluated and clarifications have been made, and then bringing it back to your authoritative system, you don't have to worry about pollution in terms of data quality. You know that the content that you have in your reports has already been vetted. So there's no second guessing.
Yeah. Awesome. And what's the latency, right? We're dealing with two separate systems now. What's the latency between the information going back and forth? Is it something which we have to wait a week for, or is it something which is, what's that view?
Yeah, right now it's 10 minutes by default, but if you want the information to be more real time and set up the communication to be every minute or two, we could set that up. But nobody seems to have any issue with the 10-minute.
Mhm.
That's as real time as most people need in terms of tracking assessments where they are, whether they're 10% complete or 15% complete. Not a lot's going to change
Yep.
between 2 and 10 minutes, unless they go take that coffee break. Like you talked about.
That's right. So one other piece that's often a challenge in the managing systems, systems like Archer or others, is that if I want to add an additional sentence into the information that I'm sending out to a respondent, and into the email, or I want to make some of those types of modifications, or not have it be branded as Archer, but actually have it branded as our company. How about those sort of soft touch aspects? Where does the portal help with that?
Yeah, very simple. There is for those folks who have the administrator role on the portal, whoever the customer assigns as the administrator, there's some fairly simple configuration items in there where you can do things like change the response time from 10 minutes to 2 minutes if you wanted to. All of the built-in notifications are there. You can change the content of the notifications on the
Mhm.
fly. You can also add attachments to notifications, which is something that's pretty unique.
Hmm.
Most system notifications don't carry attachments with them in the larger platforms. The CAP does. So
Yep.
you can provide training and enablement, that type of thing. There are areas where you can change the branding, add logos, and just to reassure your responders that the information that they're being asked for is actually coming back to the customer, coming back to the organization. So it's not branded, for example, Castle Hill,
Yep.
right? If it's IBM, you can have the IBM colors and the IBM logo in the upper corner.
Yep. Awesome. And how much configuration has to happen on the portal, right? Is it something you're doing every day? Is it something that people are doing a lot of that type of work?
No, I think once you get the configuration set for your environment, things run pretty smoothly. Occasionally, we come out with some version updates, which may require the customer or Castle Hill to go in on their behalf and make a few minor adjustments. But the onboarding of the platform itself is quite simple. Configuration is quite simple. Generally speaking, the part that takes the longest is just setting up the secure FTP
Mhm.
back and forth. And after that, we're generally ready to go.
Okay. I know we're coming up on time here. Anything that I've not asked you about relative to, the service and how we use the portal for it?
No, I actually I think that's pretty well covered. The one thing that I would emphasize, though, that I know that we just glossed over a little bit, is when organizations take a look at the CAP, they generally think of their service providers first and service provider assessments, third-party risk management, that type of thing. It shouldn't be understated that it's also an outstanding assessment portal for internal teams. It just
Mhm.
makes things a lot easier to manage.
The lack of training requirements and the simplicity of responding to the questions that
Right.
we targeted our vendor respondents for is just the same as internal teams, right? The first line.
Correct. Yep.
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 Yep. Great point. Well, I really appreciate it, Justin. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for listening along to Coffee Talk with Castle Hill. Again, we do this on a weekly basis, as often as we can, barring holidays and other activities. But please, again, join us again at www.castlehillrisk.com and Coffee Talk with Castle Hill. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you, Tim.